The rain drummed against the window of the dimly lit cafe where Marcus sat, his fingers tracing the worn edges of a leather-bound copy of The Prince. At 28, he had learned the hard way that good intentions and genuine kindness, while admirable, often left him forgotten in the wake of more captivating personalities. It was here, surrounded by the aroma of coffee and the quiet murmur of conversations, that he began to understand what Machiavelli truly meant when he wrote about the necessity of being both the lion and the fox. Marcus had always been the reliable friend, the one who listened patiently to relationship troubles, who offered a shoulder to cry on, who was always there when needed, yet never the one who was desired. His recent experience with Sarah, a brilliant marketing executive who had occupied his thoughts for months, had crystallized this painful reality. Despite their deep conversations, shared interests, and undeniable intellectual connection, she had chosen someone else. Someone who seemed to effortlessly command her attention and imagination. It was during this period of reflection that Marcus stumbled upon an insight that would reshape his understanding of human attraction and influence. The very qualities that made someone a good person, predictability, availability, unconditional support, were often the same qualities that made them forgettable in the realm of romantic pursuit. This wasn't a cynical observation about human nature being fundamentally flawed. Rather, it was an acknowledgement of how the human mind actually works when it comes to attention, memory, and desire. The first psychological principle that Marcus discovered was rooted in what cognitive scientists call the spacing effect and intermittent reinforcement schedule. Just as Machiavelli observed that a prince who is always generous will eventually be taken for granted, Marcus realized that constant availability creates a psychological backdrop rather than a compelling figure. The human brain is wired to notice changes, contrasts, and unpredictability. When someone is always there, always responsive, always agreeable, they become part of the environmental constant rather than a source of intrigue. This revelation led Marcus to what he would later call the first trick: strategic scarcity. The principle wasn't about playing games or being manipulative in a harmful way. It was about understanding that attention is a finite resource, and like any resource, its value increases with scarcity. When Marcus began to implement strategic unavailability, not responding to every text immediately, having his own plans and priorities, creating natural gaps in his accessibility, something remarkable happened. The women in his life began to wonder what he was doing, whom he was with, and why he wasn't as constantly available as before. The key to strategic scarcity lies in its authenticity. Marcus didn't simply ignore people or create artificial delays. Instead, he genuinely invested in his own life, pursuing hobbies, building friendships, and developing skills that made him naturally less available. He took up rock climbing, joined a book club, and began learning Italian. These weren't calculated moves designed solely to create scarcity. They were investments in becoming a more interesting, well-rounded person. The scarcity was a natural byproduct of having a fuller life. During this transformation, Marcus encountered Elena, a curator at a local art gallery. Elena was the kind of woman who seemed to float through life with an effortless grace that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She was intelligent, cultured, and possessed that rare quality of being genuinely interested in the world around her. Marcus found himself immediately attracted to her, but instead of falling into his old patterns of availability and predictability, he applied his newfound understanding. When Elena invited him to a gallery opening, Marcus expressed genuine interest but mentioned he might be late due to his climbing practice. When she texted him about a book recommendation, he responded thoughtfully but not immediately, often sharing insights from his own reading or experiences. This wasn't calculated coldness. It was the natural rhythm of someone who had his own life and priorities. The effect was palpable. Elena began to mention him to her friends, wondering aloud about his thoughts on various topics and finding herself curious about his activities during their times apart. The strategic scarcity had created what psychologists call cognitive load. Her mind was actively working to fill in the gaps in her knowledge about him, and this mental activity created a deeper level of engagement than constant, predictable interaction ever could. The second trick: emotional contrast, emerged from Marcus's study of Machiavelli's observation that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. While Marcus had no intention of deceiving anyone, he recognized the profound truth in this observation about human psychology. People are drawn to strong emotional experiences, especially when those experiences are unexpected. Marcus began to understand that emotional flatness, being consistently pleasant, agreeable, and positive, created no memorable imprint on the psyche. The human memory system is designed to retain information that has emotional significance, and mild, consistent pleasantness simply doesn't trigger the biochemical processes that cement experiences in long-term memory. This didn't mean Marcus became artificially dramatic or emotionally manipulative. Instead, he became more authentic in expressing his full range of emotions and opinions. When he disagreed with something, he expressed it thoughtfully but clearly. When he was excited about an idea, he allowed that enthusiasm to show. When something frustrated him, he acknowledged it rather than always maintaining an even-keeled demeanor. The breakthrough came during a dinner with Elena, where she made a comment about modern art that Marcus found intellectually shallow. In the past, he would have nodded agreeably or perhaps offered a mild correction. Instead, he paused, looked at her directly, and said, "I have to respectfully disagree with that perspective, and here's why I think it misses something important about the artist's intent." He then engaged her in a passionate but respectful debate about the role of context in artistic interpretation. Elena later told him that this moment was when she began to see him as more than just another pleasant acquaintance. The emotional contrast, moving from easy conversation to intellectual passion, had created a memorable experience that she found herself replaying in her mind. She began to wonder what other depths he might reveal, what other surprising perspectives he might hold. This principle of emotional contrast extended beyond intellectual disagreements. Marcus learned to vary his emotional temperature in subtle but meaningful ways. He might be playfully teasing during one conversation and deeply serious during another. He might be supportive and comforting when Elena faced a work challenge, then challenging and provocative when discussing her assumptions about her career goals. The key was authenticity. These emotional contrasts weren't performed. They were expressions of Marcus's genuine complexity as a human being. The difference was that he stopped censoring himself in an attempt to be consistently pleasant and instead allowed his full personality to emerge in its natural complexity. As Marcus delved deeper into understanding the psychology of influence, he discovered the third trick: the power of unfinished stories. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the importance of maintaining mystery and unpredictability, noting that everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. Marcus interpreted this to mean that complete transparency, while valuable in established relationships, can be counterproductive in the early stages of attraction. The human brain is equipped with what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency to remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. When someone shares too much too quickly, when they lay all their cards on the table immediately, they satisfy the brain's curiosity rather than stimulating it. Marcus began to view his personal narrative not as a book to be read cover to cover in one sitting, but as a serial novel that revealed its mysteries gradually. This manifested in how he shared stories about his past, his dreams, and his experiences. Instead of offering complete narratives, he learned to share intriguing fragments that invited questions. When Elena asked about his decision to start rock climbing, instead of giving a comprehensive explanation about his fitness goals and psychological motivations, Marcus simply said, "I had an experience last year that made me realize I'd been living too safely. Climbing helps me remember what I learned that day." The unfinished story created curiosity. Elena found herself wondering what that experience had been, what lesson he'd learned, and how it connected to other aspects of his personality. The incomplete information created what cognitive scientists call an information gap, a space that the mind naturally seeks to fill. Marcus applied this principle across multiple dimensions of his interactions. He might mention a book that had profoundly influenced his worldview without immediately explaining how. He might reference a friend by name in an anecdote without providing full context about their relationship. He might allude to future plans or past adventures without offering complete details. The power of unfinished stories lay not in withholding information manipulatively, but in understanding the natural rhythm of human curiosity and connection. Just as a good novelist doesn't reveal all the character's motivations in the first chapter, Marcus learned to let his own character unfold gradually, creating anticipation and sustained interest. This approach had an unexpected benefit. It forced Marcus to become more interesting to himself. As he paid attention to which stories and experiences were worth sharing partially, he began to seek out more experiences worth having. He started taking weekend trips without documenting every moment on social media. He began reading more challenging books so he'd have more complex ideas to reference obliquely. He developed opinions on topics he'd previously ignored. The unfinished story principle also extended to his future plans and ambitions. Instead of laying out detailed 5-year plans or comprehensive descriptions of his career goals, Marcus learned to speak in terms of intriguing possibilities and emerging directions. "I'm exploring some interesting opportunities that could change everything," he might say, rather than providing a detailed explanation of his job search or business ideas. Elena found herself thinking about these conversational fragments during their times apart. She would wonder about the details he hadn't shared, the experiences he'd alluded to, the decisions that had shaped him. This mental activity kept Marcus present in her thoughts even when he wasn't physically present, creating the kind of sustained psychological engagement that forms the foundation of deep attraction. Part 2. The Architecture of Desire. Advanced psychological strategies. As autumn deepened and his relationship with Elena evolved from casual encounters to something more substantial, Marcus encountered new challenges that required a more sophisticated understanding of psychological influence. It was during this period that he discovered the fourth trick: social proof and pre-selection, a principle that Machiavelli would have recognized as the importance of reputation and the power of being valued by others. The insight came during an evening when Elena accompanied Marcus to a gathering at his climbing gym. Marcus had been developing friendships with other climbers over the months, and as they moved through the space, he found himself naturally engaging with various people, offering encouragement to a newcomer struggling with a difficult route, discussing beta strategies with more experienced climbers, and being consulted by the gym staff about route-setting ideas. Elena watched these interactions with growing fascination. She was seeing Marcus not just as the man she knew from their private conversations, but as someone who occupied a valued position in a community she knew nothing about. The other climbers clearly respected his judgment, sought his advice, and enjoyed his company. More significantly, several attractive women in the climbing community interacted with Marcus with obvious warmth and familiarity. This observation triggered what evolutionary psychologists call mate choice copying, the tendency to find someone more attractive when they are valued by others, particularly by members of one's own gender. Elena found herself seeing Marcus through new eyes, not because anything about him had fundamentally changed, but because she was witnessing evidence of his value in a social context she hadn't previously considered. The principle of social proof operates on multiple psychological levels. At its most basic, it provides evidence that someone possesses qualities worth valuing. If other people find someone interesting, competent, or attractive, there's likely a good reason. More subtly, it triggers what psychologists call scarcity mindset. If someone is valued by others, they become less available, and scarcity increases perceived value. Marcus began to understand that authentic social proof couldn't be manufactured or faked. It had to be earned through genuine engagement with various communities and activities. The months he'd spent developing climbing skills, building friendships, and contributing to the climbing community had created natural social proof that spoke more powerfully than any amount of self-promotion could have achieved. This realization led Marcus to invest even more intentionally in diverse social connections and skill development. He joined a wine tasting group, began attending philosophy meetups, and started volunteering with a literacy program. These weren't calculated moves designed solely to create social proof. They were extensions of his genuine interests and values. However, they had the natural consequence of placing him in various social contexts where his qualities could be observed and valued by different groups of people. The key to authentic social proof lies in genuine contribution. Marcus wasn't simply collecting social connections. He was finding ways to add value to different communities. At the wine tastings, he brought his natural curiosity and analytical thinking to discussions of terroir and vintage characteristics. At philosophy meetups, he contributed thoughtful questions and perspectives drawn from his extensive reading. In his volunteer work, he brought patience and enthusiasm to helping adults improve their reading skills. Elena began to notice how often other people spoke positively about Marcus or mentioned interesting things he had said or done. A mutual friend might reference a thoughtful comment Marcus had made about a book. Elena's colleague might mention that Marcus had given excellent advice about wine pairings for a dinner party. These indirect testimonials carried far more weight than any amount of self-promotion Marcus might have attempted. The social proof principle also worked in reverse. As Elena became more interested in Marcus, her own attention and validation began to serve as social proof for others. Other women in their extended social circle began to notice Elena's interest and started paying more attention to Marcus themselves. This created a positive feedback loop where increased attention led to increased social validation. which in turn led to even more attention. Marcus learnt to leverage this dynamic without exploiting it. He remained genuine in all his interactions, never led anyone on, and was honest about his growing relationship with Elena. However, he also didn't hide his social connections or downplay the friendships and activities that showcased his multifaceted personality. The fifth trick. Creating positive anxiety represented Marcus's most sophisticated understanding of psychological influence. This concept emerged from his study of attachment theory combined with Machiavelli's observations about the balance between fear and love in human relationships. Machiavelli famously wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." While Marcus had no interest in being feared in any harmful sense, he began to understand that a certain type of psychological tension, what he came to think of as positive anxiety, was essential for maintaining romantic interest and emotional investment. Positive anxiety differs fundamentally from negative anxiety or fear. While negative anxiety comes from threats to safety, security, or well-being, positive anxiety emerges from uncertainty about something we value and desire. It's the flutter of excitement before a first date, the anticipation of hearing back after a job interview, or the thrill of not knowing how a compelling story will end. Marcus observed that his early relationships had often suffered from a lack of this positive anxiety. By being completely predictable, always available, and entirely transparent about his feelings and intentions, he had eliminated the psychological tension that keeps romantic interest alive. There were no questions left unanswered, no mysteries to solve, no anticipation to maintain engagement. Creating positive anxiety required a delicate balance. Too little uncertainty and the relationship became psychologically flat. Too much uncertainty, and it became stressful rather than exciting. Marcus needed to find ways to maintain just enough unpredictability to keep Elena's mind actively engaged without creating genuine insecurity or distress. One way Marcus implemented this principle was through what he called benevolent unpredictability. Instead of establishing rigid patterns in their communication in meetings, he varied his approach in subtle but noticeable ways. Sometimes he might suggest elaborate date plans. Other times he might propose spontaneous adventures. Sometimes he would text Elena good night. Other times he might send a thought-provoking article mid-morning with no additional comment. The key was that all of this unpredictability occurred within a framework of fundamental reliability and respect. Elena never doubted Marcus's genuine interest in her or his basic trustworthiness. The uncertainty existed at the level of, what interesting thing might he do next, rather than, does he actually care about me? Marcus also learned to create positive anxiety through what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. Instead of providing constant validation and attention, he varied the intensity and timing of his positive responses. This didn't mean being cold or withholding. Rather, it meant that his warmth and attention, when given, carried more impact because it wasn't completely predictable. When Elena shared something she was excited about, Marcus might respond with enthusiastic engagement one time and thoughtful questions another time. When she looked particularly attractive, he might comment appreciatively sometimes, and other times simply give her a look that conveyed his appreciation without words. This variability kept Elena's mind active, never quite sure what type of response to expect, which paradoxically made all of his responses more memorable and impactful. The principle of positive anxiety also extended to their physical interactions. Instead of following predictable patterns of affection and intimacy, Marcus learned to vary the timing, intensity, and style of physical connection. Sometimes he might be playfully affectionate in public. Other times he might maintain more distance, letting tension build before moments of connection. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus applied the positive anxiety principle to the progression of their relationship itself. Instead of rushing toward conventional milestones or making his long-term intentions completely explicit, he allowed the relationship to unfold with natural uncertainty about its ultimate direction. This didn't mean being dishonest about his feelings, rather it meant allowing the future to remain genuinely open and unscripted. Elena found herself thinking about Marcus not just when they were apart, but when they were together as well. She would catch herself studying his expressions, wondering what he was thinking, trying to predict his reactions to various situations. This active mental engagement created a deeper level of psychological investment than would have occurred in a more predictable relationship dynamic. As winter approached, Marcus reflected on how profoundly his understanding of human psychology had evolved. The transformation hadn't been about becoming someone different. It had been about expressing his authentic self in ways that naturally aligned with how the human mind processes attraction, attention, and desire. Part 3. The Unbreakable Self. Integration and Mastery. The snow had begun to fall in earnest by December, blanketing the city in a pristine whiteness that seemed to mirror the clarity Marcus had achieved in his understanding of himself and others. His relationship with Elena had deepened into something substantial and meaningful, but more importantly, Marcus had undergone a fundamental transformation that extended far beyond romantic success. He had become what Machiavelli might have called virtuous in the classical sense, not merely good, but effective, self-possessed and genuinely formidable in his ability to navigate the complexities of human nature. The phrase, "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," had taken on profound meaning for Marcus as he integrated the psychological principles he had learned into a coherent philosophy of self-development. He began to understand that the 5 tricks were not merely techniques for attracting romantic interest, but fundamental principles for creating an authentic, attractive personality that would serve him in all areas of life. The process of destroying his weak self had not been about suppressing his natural kindness, empathy, or genuine care for others. Instead, it had been about eliminating the unconscious patterns of neediness, predictability, and self-diminishment that had previously undermined his natural attractive qualities. The weak self was not his compassionate nature. It was the part of him that sought validation through constant availability, that feared conflict through excessive agreeableness, and that dimmed his own light in misguided attempts to make others comfortable. Marcus had come to realize that his old patterns were not actually kind or generous. They were subtly manipulative in their own way. By being constantly available and agreeable, he had been unconsciously trying to earn affection and avoid rejection. True kindness, he learned, sometimes meant being unavailable when he needed to focus on his own growth. True generosity sometimes meant challenging someone's assumptions rather than simply validating them. True care sometimes meant maintaining appropriate boundaries rather than sacrificing his own well-being to meet others' expectations. The destruction of his weak self had been a gradual process of recognizing and eliminating these unconscious patterns. Each time he chose to pursue his own interests instead of being immediately available, each time he expressed a genuine disagreement instead of false harmony, each time he allowed mystery to exist instead of over-explaining himself, he was choosing strength over weakness, authenticity over people-pleasing. This transformation had created what Marcus came to think of as integrated attractiveness, a way of being in the world that was simultaneously genuine and psychologically compelling. The 5 tricks had become natural expressions of a more complete version of himself rather than techniques he applied consciously. Strategic scarcity had evolved into healthy self-focus. Marcus no longer created artificial unavailability. Instead, he genuinely had a rich, full life that naturally limited his availability. His climbing, reading, volunteering, and various other interests weren't strategies for creating scarcity. They were expressions of his authentic curiosity and desire for growth. The scarcity was a byproduct of living genuinely rather than a calculated effect he tried to achieve. Emotional contrast had become emotional authenticity. Marcus no longer thought about varying his emotional temperature for effect. Instead, he simply allowed his genuine emotions and opinions to emerge naturally. He had learned to trust that his authentic self was interesting enough without embellishment or suppression. When he disagreed with someone, he expressed it thoughtfully. When he felt passion about an idea, he let it show. When he was frustrated or disappointed, he acknowledged it appropriately rather than maintaining artificial positivity. The power of unfinished stories had transformed into natural depth and complexity. Marcus had genuinely become a more interesting person with more experiences, insights, and perspectives worth sharing. He no longer needed to strategically withhold information, because his actual life contained enough genuine depth that sharing everything immediately would have been impossible anyway. The mystery existed naturally because he was continuously growing, learning, and evolving. Social proof had become genuine social value. Marcus's connections and friendships weren't networking strategies. They were authentic relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests. He had become someone worth knowing not because he was trying to impress others, but because he genuinely contributed value to the various communities he belonged to. His reputation was based on real competence, character, and contribution rather than carefully managed impressions. Creating positive anxiety had evolved into natural dynamism. Marcus no longer needed to consciously vary his patterns or create uncertainty. His authentic self was naturally unpredictable. In healthy ways, he made decisions based on his genuine preferences and circumstances, rather than trying to maintain artificial patterns. This natural variability kept his relationships fresh and engaging without requiring conscious management. The integration of these principles had created what Marcus thought of as unshakable attractiveness, a quality that couldn't be diminished by others' opinions, rejection, or changing circumstances. Because his attractiveness was rooted in genuine self-development rather than external validation or manipulative techniques, it remained stable regardless of how others responded to him. This became apparent when Marcus encountered Jessica, a successful attorney who seemed initially unimpressed by his presence at a mutual friend's party. In his previous mindset, Marcus might have tried harder to win her approval, becoming more available, more agreeable, or more eager to please. Instead, he remained genuinely himself, engaging when natural conversation arose, but not pursuing her attention or approval. Jessica's initial indifference actually served to demonstrate Marcus's internal transformation. Her lack of immediate interest didn't trigger his old patterns of self-doubt or increased effort to win her over. Instead, he remained centered in his own value, continuing to engage authentically with others at the party and enjoying himself regardless of her response. What happened next illustrated the power of unshakable attractiveness. Jessica began to notice Marcus's interactions with others, observing how he commanded respect from men and interest from women without seeming to try. She witnessed his confident disagreement with another guest about economic policy, his easy camaraderie with the host, and his natural leadership when the group decided to change venues. By the end of the evening, Jessica was actively seeking opportunities to engage Marcus in conversation, intrigued by someone who seemed genuinely unconcerned with her approval. The quality that had initially made her dismiss him, his lack of obvious effort to impress her, had ultimately made him more interesting to her than the men who had been clearly vying for her attention. Marcus's relationship with Elena had provided the perfect laboratory for testing and refining these principles. Elena herself was a woman of depth and intelligence who wouldn't have been satisfied with surface-level attraction techniques or manipulative behavior. The fact that their relationship continued to deepen and strengthen over time validated Marcus's approach of building genuine attractiveness rather than relying on short-term tactics. Elena later told Marcus that what had initially drawn her to him was her sense that he was a man with secrets, not hidden agendas or deceptive intentions, but depths that would take time to explore and understand. She was attracted to the fact that he seemed to have his own life and priorities, that he challenged her thinking, that he remained somewhat unpredictable even as she got to know him better. More importantly, Elena appreciated that Marcus's attractive qualities were integrated with genuine character and values. His confidence wasn't arrogance. His mystery wasn't deception. His emotional range wasn't manipulation. He had managed to become psychologically compelling while remaining fundamentally trustworthy and kind. The principle of destroying the weak self extended far beyond romantic relationships. Marcus found that his professional life also improved dramatically as he applied these insights. In business meetings, his natural scarcity, due to genuine engagement in multiple projects, made his input more valued. His willingness to express disagreement respectfully made his agreements carry more weight. His depth of knowledge and experience created natural authority without arrogance. Marcus also discovered that these principles created positive feedback loops in all areas of his life. As he became more genuinely interesting and self-possessed, he attracted more interesting opportunities and relationships. These new experiences further developed his confidence and competence, which in turn made him even more attractive to others. The transformation had not been without challenges. There were moments when Marcus had to resist falling back into old patterns, particularly when faced with rejection or indifference. There were times when maintaining appropriate boundaries felt uncomfortable, when expressing disagreement seemed risky, or when allowing mystery to exist required resisting the urge to over-explain himself. However, each time Marcus chose strength over weakness, authenticity over people-pleasing, and self-respect over external validation, he reinforced the new patterns that had made him genuinely attractive. The weak self became increasingly powerless as the strong self was repeatedly chosen and reinforced. One of the most profound realizations Marcus had was that the 5 psychological tricks were not about manipulating others, but about revealing the most attractive version of his authentic self. The techniques worked not because they deceived people about who he was, but because they allowed his genuine value to be perceived and appreciated. Strategic scarcity worked because Marcus genuinely had valuable qualities worth wanting access to. Emotional contrast worked because Marcus authentically possessed depth and complexity worth exploring. Unfinished stories worked because Marcus actually had interesting experiences and insights worth learning about. Social proof worked because Marcus genuinely contributed value to various communities. Positive anxiety worked because Marcus was authentically dynamic and unpredictable in healthy ways. The destruction of his weak self had been ultimately about alignment, bringing his external presentation into harmony with his internal value. The weak self had been characterized by a fundamental misalignment, possessing genuine value but presenting it in ways that obscured or diminished its impact. As Marcus looked toward the future, he understood that the principles he had learned were not temporary techniques, but permanent aspects of an attractive personality. The 5 tricks had become 5 virtues. The virtue of having a rich, full life that created natural scarcity, the virtue of emotional authenticity that created natural contrast, the virtue of genuine depth that created natural mystery, the virtue of social contribution that created natural proof, and the virtue of authentic dynamism that created natural excitement. The man who had destroyed his weak self could indeed never be destroyed by others because his value and attractiveness were no longer dependent on external validation or approval. Whether Elena continued to be interested in him, whether Jessica found him attractive, whether his friends valued his company, these external responses, while pleasant when positive, no longer determined his sense of self-worth or his confidence in his own value. This unshakable foundation had created what Marcus thought of as attractive abundance, the ability to approach all relationships from a position of genuine value rather than need. He could be generous with his attention and affection not because he was trying to earn something in return, but because he genuinely had value to offer and could afford to be generous. The irony was not lost on Marcus that by becoming less needy of others' approval, he had become far more attractive to others. By developing genuine self-sufficiency, he had become someone others genuinely wanted to be around. By destroying his weak self, the part that sought validation through constant availability and agreeableness, he had revealed the strong self that others naturally found compelling. The journey that had begun with romantic disappointment had evolved into comprehensive personal transformation. The 5 psychological tricks had been the catalyst, but the real achievement was the integrated personality that had emerged, a personality that was simultaneously attractive, authentic, and aligned with genuine values and character. As the snow continued to fall outside his window, Marcus reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. He was no longer the man who waited anxiously for texts to be returned, who worried about whether he had said the right thing, or who diminished himself in hopes of making others comfortable. He had become a man who was comfortable with himself, confident in his value, and capable of creating genuine attraction through the natural expression of his authentic self. The weak self had indeed been destroyed, but what had emerged in its place was not harder or less caring. It was simply more genuine, more complete, and ultimately more attractive to the kind of people worth attracting. The 5 tricks had taught Marcus not how to manipulate others into wanting him, but how to become the kind of person who was naturally worth wanting. The transformation was complete, but Marcus understood that it was also ongoing. Each day presented new opportunities to choose strength over weakness, authenticity over artifice, and self-respect over the need for approval. The principles he had learned were not a destination, but a way of traveling through life, a way that made the journey itself more fulfilling and the traveler more attractive to fellow journeyers worth knowing. In the end, Marcus had discovered that the most powerful psychological trick was the simplest: becoming genuinely worthy of the attention, respect, and affection he desired. Everything else was simply about allowing that worthiness to be seen and appreciated. The man who had destroyed his weak self had indeed become indestructible, not through hardness or manipulation, but through the unshakable foundation of authentic self-worth and genuine attractiveness.